The lights from the towering 10-foot Christmas tree shimmered against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my parents' Los Angeles mansion, reflecting off gold-trimmed ornaments and delicate crystal angels. Outside, the city skyline glowed under the holiday lights, an extravagant display of wealth and power. The long mahogany dining table, covered in a velvet red tablecloth, was already set with fine porcelain dinnerware and silver cutlery polished to perfection. A feast fit for royalty awaited the family gathering: roast turkey, glazed ham, fresh oysters, and champagne ready to be poured. This was the world my parents, Harold and Linda Carter, had built, one where status meant everything, and appearances were more important than love. I, Sarah Williams, had never truly belonged in that world. At 37 years old, I was a high school teacher, married to Daniel, a software engineer making $85 a year, a good, stable income, but nowhere near the wealth my parents expected from a son-in-law. We lived a simple but happy life in a cozy suburban neighborhood, where our greatest joys were movie nights, weekend soccer games, and home-cooked meals. But to my parents, our modest existence was an embarrassment. My siblings, however, had met their impossible standards. Sophia, my older sister, was the golden child, married to a celebrity plastic surgeon who catered to Hollywood's elite. Her twin sons attended the best private schools, played competitive golf, and spent summers in Europe. My younger brother, Jason, a professor at an Ivy League university, had a daughter who excelled in STEM and had already started coding at 10. My parents worshipped their grandchildren, flaunting their accomplishments at every high society gathering. But my son, Jake, my sweet, thoughtful, 9-year-old boy, was treated as if he barely existed. I still remembered the first time I noticed it. We were at my mother's exclusive holiday luncheon, surrounded by women in designer dresses and diamond earrings the size of grapes. As they gushed about their grandchildren's horseback riding lessons, violin recitals, and equestrian competitions, I waited for my mother to say something, anything, about Jake. She never did. That day, it dawned on me, she wasn't proud of him. And it wasn't because he wasn't smart. Jake was bright, curious, and kind, loved by his teachers, always eager to help his classmates. He played soccer, loved painting, and could spend hours building intricate Lego cities. But none of that mattered to my parents. He wasn't raised in wealth. He wasn't part of their world. Lately, Jake had started noticing the difference too. The closer Christmas came, the more reluctant he became about visiting his grandparents. "Mom, do I have to go?" he asked one evening. His voice small. I stopped washing the dishes and turned to him. His brown eyes, usually full of mischief and joy, were filled with hesitation. I knelt beside him, brushing his messy curls from his face. "Just for a little while, sweetheart." I tried to smile, but deep down, I felt the same dread. I didn't want to go either. But this year, I would not let them hurt my son. Not again. Jake's hesitation had been growing for weeks. The closer Christmas came, the more nervous and withdrawn he became. He had stopped talking about Santa, about presents, about the holiday magic that used to fill him with excitement. Instead, he kept asking me the same question, his voice smaller each time. "Mom, do I have to go?" Each time, my heart clenched. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him he never had to set foot in that house again. But how could I? It was family. It was tradition. And no matter how much pain my parents caused me, a part of me still clung to the hope that things could change. So on Christmas afternoon, we arrived at my parents' mansion in Beverly Hills, its massive gates swinging open as we pulled into the circular driveway. Sophia's sleek white Tesla was already parked out front, along with Jason's luxury sedan. The house loomed over us, its towering windows reflecting the winter sun, elegant and imposing. Jake hesitated before getting out of the car, his small fingers gripping my hand so tightly I could feel the fear pulsing through them. "It'll be okay," I whispered, forcing a smile, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it. Inside, the scent of roast turkey and cinnamon filled the air, mixing with the soft hum of classical music playing in the background. My mother appeared at the entrance, dressed in an exquisite silk dress, her pearl earrings glinting under the chandelier light. She kissed my cheek lightly before stepping back. barely acknowledging Jake. "You're late," she murmured, eyes flickering past me toward the grand living room. In the lavish space, my nieces and nephews laughed and unwrapped presents. Surrounded by a mountain of gifts beneath the enormous Christmas tree, Sophia's twin boys were already engrossed in their brand new gaming consoles, while Jason's daughter tapped away on a high-end tablet. Their gifts were extravagant, wrapped in shimmering gold paper, stacked in neat piles. Jake stood frozen at my side, his fingers still clutching mine. Dinner was a grand affair. As always, my father sat at the head of the table, his voice booming with pride as he toasted to our family's success and our accomplished children. Daniel, sitting beside me, tried to join in the conversation, but was swiftly ignored, and when Jake excitedly began to share a story about his latest soccer game, my mother cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Let's save the children's stories for later." The words cut through me like a knife. I glanced at Jake, his face falling, his excitement dimming into silence. He pushed his peas around his plate, his small shoulders hunched. I clenched my fists beneath the table, rage simmering under my skin. I should have left then. I should have taken my son and walked away. But the worst was still to come. Dinner was over, and the tension in the air was palpable. My mother's words still echoed in my mind. "Let's save the children's stories for later." Jake had fallen silent, his usual bright energy extinguished, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. I wanted to scream, to stand up and demand that my parents see him for the wonderful child he was. But instead, I swallowed my anger and held his hand tightly as we moved to the grand living room for the gift exchange. The Christmas tree stood towering and magnificent, its gold and silver ornaments reflecting the warm glow of the chandelier above. Beneath it, a mountain of beautifully wrapped presents stretched across the floor. The excitement was infectious. Sophia's twins eagerly tore into their gifts, unwrapping the latest gaming consoles, designer sneakers, and expensive gadgets. Jason's daughter gasped as she unboxed a high-end tablet, an exclusive art set, and premium headphones. Their eyes sparkled with joy, their laughter filling the room. Jake's grip on my hand tightened. His eyes darted toward me, uncertain but hopeful. And then my mother turned to him, holding out a small box wrapped in plain silver paper. "Here you go, Jake," she said, her smile thin and unreadable. Jake hesitated, glancing at me before taking the gift. Carefully, he unwrapped the paper, peeling it back with trembling fingers. The entire room seemed to slow as he lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Jake blinked, staring into the empty box as if he had misunderstood. He looked up at my mother. Confusion etched across his innocent face. "Grandma?" His voice was barely a whisper. My mother's smile didn't waver. "He doesn't need anything," she said smoothly, her tone almost mocking. The weight of her words hit me like a sledgehammer. The humiliation, the cruelty, the sheer heartlessness of it. Jake sucked in a shaky breath, his small chest rising and falling too fast. Then, his face crumpled, tears welled in his wide, wounded eyes, and his small body trembled as he clutched the useless box. I saw red. The laughter of my nieces and nephews faded into nothing. The grandeur of the mansion, the chandeliers, the luxury, it all blurred into insignificance. All that mattered in that moment was my son, standing there, heartbroken. For the first time that night, I let go of my restraint. I stood up, walked over to my son, and wrapped my arms around him. Without a word, I lifted him into my arms, turned on my heel, and walked toward the door. The room fell into stunned silence. Daniel was already ahead of me, his jaw clenched with quiet fury, ready to leave. Behind us, no one spoke, even Sophia and Jason, who had been oblivious to our parents' cruelty for so long, sat frozen in disbelief. As I reached the front door, I paused for a brief moment. My eyes flickered to the framed family portraits lining the hallway, photos of smiling faces. Carefully staged perfection, a false image of love and unity. I turned away. Outside, the cold night air hit my face as Jake buried his face in my shoulder. His quiet sobs muffled against my sweater. Daniel reached out, squeezing my hand. "Never again," he said, his voice low and firm. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Never again. The next morning, My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It was still dark outside when the vibrations jolted me awake, the sharp glow of the screen illuminating the bedroom. Daniel stirred beside me, exhaling a deep sigh as he turned over. But I was already awake, my heart pounding as I reached for my phone. The family group chat was in absolute chaos. Sophia, what happened last night was completely unacceptable. Jason, this wasn't just rude. It was cruel. It was humiliating. I would never treat even my students like that. Sophia, I keep replaying Jake's face in my head. The way he looked when he saw that empty box. I can't believe it. Jason, Mom and Dad crossed a line. I sat up, gripping my phone tighter. My siblings, the ones who had always ignored my parents' favoritism, who had always looked the other way, were finally seeing what I had known all along. But before I could even process the relief that came with their outrage, another message popped up. Mom, Sarah made her choices. She decided to lower herself. This is what happens when you marry someone beneath your status. I froze. A cold fury spread through my chest. Slow and deliberate, like a fire that refused to be ignored. My fingers trembled as I reread those words, feeling the weight of them sink into my skin. They weren't just dismissing me, they were dismissing Jake. They were justifying their cruelty, pretending that what they had done wasn't pure, deliberate humiliation. Daniel sat up beside me, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Sarah? His voice was thick with concern. I handed him the phone, watching his face shift from confusion to disgust. His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. That's it, he muttered. They don't get to do this anymore. I nodded, swallowing hard. Enough was enough. Without hesitation, I opened the chat and typed, "Me, if that's how you feel, then let's make things clear. We will no longer be a part of your lives. I will not allow you to hurt my son again." Before I could even put my phone down, Sophia responded, "Sophia, I'm done too. I can't stand by and pretend this is okay. Jason, we need to talk." Within hours, we met at Jason's office, the high-rise windows overlooking the city as we sat around a sleek glass table. This was different. There was no false civility, no excuses, no pretending that our parents' behavior could be brushed under the rug. Jason pulled out his laptop, his voice sharp and businesslike. "I've been reviewing their finances. Do you realize how much of their lifestyle is propped up by us?" I exchanged a look with Sophia. Of course, we knew. We were the ones who had been quietly funding their luxuries. That day, we made a decision. If they thought we were beneath them, then they could survive without us. The fallout happened faster than I expected. Within days of cutting off support, the cracks in my parents' perfect world began to show. It started subtly: missed appointments, bills stacking up, whispered rumors spreading among their social circle. Then, the collapse came all at once. Their once impeccably maintained mansion, the very symbol of their wealth and power, began to fall apart. The landscapers stopped coming, leaving the garden overgrown and wild. The roof, which had always been repaired without a second thought, started leaking during a winter rainstorm. And for the first time in decades, my parents had no one to call. The heating system failed, plunging their massive house into an eerie, unbearable cold. At first, they acted as if nothing was wrong. Denial was their strongest weapon. They continued dressing in designer clothes, attending charity galas, and sipping champagne at high society luncheons. But the illusion couldn't last forever. Their country club membership was quietly revoked when payments stopped. Their so-called friends, the same people they had once sacrificed their real family for, began to disappear. Avoiding their calls, pretending they didn't know them at social events. The whispers started next. "Did you hear? The Carters are having financial trouble. I always thought they were untouchable." What happened? The final blow came when the church committee discreetly removed my mother from the charity board. The place where she had once held court, where she had built her reputation as the perfect high society woman, was now turning its back on her. Then, 2 weeks after Christmas, the doorbell rang. I had almost convinced myself they wouldn't come, that their pride would keep them locked inside their crumbling home, unwilling to admit that they needed us. But when I opened the door, I barely recognized them. My mother stood there, her once perfectly styled hair messy and unkempt, Her usual designer coat replaced by something old and worn. My father, who had always dressed in pristine cashmere and expensive suits, looked smaller, his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the past weeks had finally broken him. Sarah, my mother's voice wavered, no longer carrying its usual sharpness. Can we talk? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to shut the door in their faces, to let them feel the cold rejection they had given Jake. But I couldn't. Not yet. I stepped aside, allowing them in. The warmth of our home, the scent of fresh coffee, the soft hum of a family morning, felt worlds apart from the icy loneliness they had created for themselves. As they sat on my couch, gripping their cups with trembling hands, my father finally spoke. We're struggling. His voice cracked. For the first time, my parents were seeing the truth. Without us, they had nothing. I watched them sit there, small and defeated, gripping their coffee cups as if they were clinging to the last bit of warmth in their lives. My mother, who had once commanded every room she entered with effortless poise, now sat hunched over, staring at the floor, her hands trembling slightly. My father, always the composed and authoritative figure, looked at me with something I had never seen before, true vulnerability. We're struggling, my father admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, I said nothing. Let them feel it, I thought. Let them sit in the weight of their own choices. Let them understand what it felt like to be cast aside, to be treated as though you were nothing, as though your existence was a burden. My mother exhaled shakily, gripping her cup tighter. We didn't realize how much we depended on all of you, she admitted, and I almost laughed at the irony. They hadn't realized that their country club memberships, their lavish lifestyle, their carefully maintained reputation had all been quietly upheld by their children? But then, my father said the words that truly mattered. We're sorry. Silence filled the room. I felt Daniel's presence beside me, his quiet strength grounding me. But I barely heard anything except the pounding of my own heart. An apology, a real one, not an excuse, not a justification, not an attempt to save face. A simple, broken acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. Then came the real question, the one that had burned inside me for weeks. But why Jake? My voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. Why humiliate him like that? He's just a child. My mother finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw something raw in her eyes. Shame. She swallowed, struggling with the words. I was ashamed. A heavy stillness settled over us. Ashamed, not of Jake, not of what kind of person he was, but ashamed that he didn't fit into their perfect, curated world, that he didn't represent the wealth and status they had spent a lifetime chasing. I felt my hands clench into fists, my nails digging into my palms. They had hurt my son, not out of hatred, not out of indifference, but out of pride, their own twisted, poisonous pride. Before I could respond, a small voice cut through the tension. Grandma, why don't you like me? I turned sharply. Jake was standing at the top of the stairs, his small hands gripping the railing, his face pale but determined. How long had he been listening? My mother's breath hitched. Her lip trembled. For the first time, I saw her break. I don't deserve forgiveness, she whispered. Jake took a step forward, then another. Slowly, he came down the stairs, until he was his blue sweater. You can borrow this, Grandma, he said softly. It'll keep you warm. The dam inside my mother finally shattered. She sobbed, uncontrollably, openly, like I had never seen before. She wrapped her arms around Jake, holding onto him as if she were afraid he would disappear. My father, usually so composed, turned away, rubbing his eyes. And for the first time, I saw what real regret looked like, standing in front of her. And then, with the purest, most innocent kindness, he reached out and offered her something.